The murderous mistress of Edward VIII, Marguerite Alibert, was a French high-class prostitute who became the first lover of Edward, the Prince of Wales and heir to the British throne. She would later be at the centre of the biggest scandal of the times, and she was nearly damaged the reputation of the future king and monarchy. A series of events began to stop the scandal from getting out of control, and that is the interesting story of Marguerite Alibert, the prostitute turned princess turned murderer. Edward VIII is famously known for giving up the throne in 1937 in order to be with the love of his life, Wallis Simpson, who he was not permitted to be with because she was a divorcee twice before. This scandal was prevalent throughout Europe, but 20 years before, another scandal was taking shape. Please continue to support my channel by subscribing. The affair was kept under wraps by the prince. He only declared his feelings for his mistress on paper, and of course she kept them all. Alibert was born in 1890 into a poor family in Paris. Her parents were working class people, her father worked as a coach driver, and her mother was a domestic servant. She was known for being very beautiful, and her parents hoped her beauty would allow her to travel the world and to have a much more privileged life than them. When Alibert was 15, she began working as a servant because she had been removed from school. But she was fired as a servant when she fell pregnant and later gave birth to a daughter who was separated from her when she was sent to live with a farming family. The young girl was jobless, she had a poor education and very few life prospects, and so she turned to sex work to survive. She quickly became known as courtesan, an upper-class prostitute. At the brothel she worked in, she was known as being the most desired woman for high-standing men in society. At only 17, she was in a relationship with a 40-year-old Andre Meller, who was a wealthy Parisian. He bought her an apartment, and they conducted their affair there in private. He had a wife throughout their entire affair, but Alibert told people that they were married, and she often used his surname as her own. 10 years later in 1917, she met the Prince of Wales. She was 27 and the Prince was 22. Towards the end of World War I, the pair met, when Edward spent time partying in Paris, while he was on leave from the regiment on the Western Front. He became infatuated by his mistress, and they continued their affair for at least a year. Just as we all do, Alibert had many aspects to her personality. She could sometimes be mean with a nasty temper, and she sometimes slept with a gun under her pillow. But she was also intelligent, street-smart and articulate, despite having little education. She was talented in her role as a prostitute, with skills in the bedroom that she taught the prince. The romance between the lovers fizzled out after the prince made a number of trips to France, but she had already gathered enough evidence to sink his royal ship. Perhaps due to the distance between the pair, the prince wrote several letters to her, detailing military matters as well as revealing intimate information about the royal family, particularly problems with his parents, especially his father. This was Royal Rule 101, not to do, and was the biggest mistake he made. Without these letters, his ties to the high-class prostitute may have remained unknown. She refused to destroy the letters, never knowing when they may come in handy for her. There are at least 20 letters that were sent by Edward, and he always signed them off with the initial E. In some, he referred to Alibert as Mon Beb. She liked to remind him that she still had the letters that he sent, with threatening wording that she could do with them as she wished. Alibert went on to have a string of failed relationships and marriages, and it wasn't long before she moved on after Edward. She went on to quickly marry wealthy Frenchman Charles Laurent. She divorced him shortly later, In 1921, she converted to Islam to marry rich Egyptian playboy Ali Fahmy, who was 10 years her junior. The pair were reported to be plagued by domestic abuse on both sides, and the relationship was a toxic one. When the marriage failed, it did so in the most explosive, dramatic way. Alibert went on to kill her husband by shooting him twice, once in the back and once in the head. The married pair was staying at the hotel, the Savoy, on the September 10th, 1923. They were allegedly arguing about money and how she wished to be financially independent. The couple fought after returning from the opera, The Merry Widow, in London. There were witnesses present at the actual crime scene, and so it seemed that she would meet the gallows. She also reported that he was a rapist and that he had repeatedly forced her to have sex with him without her consent, and that she could no longer put up with the abuse. Resentment had grown throughout their relationship, and the quarrels began to become more frequent and more violent. Her anger was overflowing, and she began to write down notes of all the things she despised about him daily. Alibert had a joker card in her back pocket, and now was the perfect opportunity to use it. She was not fazed by her arrest, as she was under the impression that she would not be imprisoned for her crimes. She had kept the many letters from the prince that described his extravagant life. All the while, hundreds of British soldiers were dying in the war. She used her best bargaining chip. She was given a generous deal that meant that she could be freed if she returned all of the letters. There is a letter by an unknown author close to the royal family, revealing the fear that the French girl who's going to be tried for murder is the fancy woman who was the Prince of Wales' keep in Paris during the war, and that they are terribly afraid that he might be dragged in. It is fortunate he is off to Canada and his name is to be kept out. The generous deal also included her past as a prostitute being kept a secret, and how the trial would focus on the dead man's violence instead. The trial went ahead for the purpose of the public, but there were absolutely no intentions of her being sent away for killing her husband. The authorities wanted Marguerite to be acquitted. A murder conviction would have been catastrophic for the crown. Edward obviously stayed away from the court, instead taking a trip to Canada on a royal visit to distract from the damaging events that were taking place. The public were enthused by the proceedings. There hadn't been such an enticing story since Dr. Hawley Crippen was accused of killing his wife 13 years earlier. The crowds lined the streets around the Old Bailey, hoping to see the 32-year-old still beautiful woman that had killed her husband. The jury were told of an emotional story of a battered wife who could no longer take the abuse, and so she snapped. Her life as a prostitute was completely omitted from the court, as this would have swayed the opinion of the jury. The judge declared her innocent, and in return she handed over incriminating letters behind the scenes. Eventually she was acquitted on the grounds of self-defense, while Edward's secrets remained hidden for over a century. After she was acquitted, she returned to Paris, where she lived until her death at the age of 80 in 1971. Please continue to support my channel by subscribing. Please comment, like and subscribe if you wish for more stories, and leave your suggestions below and I will endeavour to cover them.